Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to our final winter lecture for 2014. I appreciate tonight's presenter is Dr. Bryce Edwards, who is obviously well known in New Zealand political circles through his commentary. Power and conflict are key issues in politics, says Dr. Edwards. In my teaching and research, I'm always asking questions about who really runs New Zealand, how is policy really made by governments, who has the most power in society, and how are resources divided up in society. I aim to promote critical thinking and a consideration of a diversity of points of views and ways of understanding politics. So tonight's lecture is Politics of Scandal, Sex, Corruption and Lies in Election Year. Bryce.
Okay, hello everyone. As you can see, I'm not the most professional public speaker ever. I've arrived here by running up from the railway station. This trip up from Dunedin has really nicely coincided with the release today of Nikki Hagar's new book, and so I've just been at the launch for that, and I got a bit too involved in it all, and finally had to jump on a bus and come here and run up from the railway station. So that's what, if I'm looking flustered, it's partly because of that. I'm not the only one, very good. So I will talk a bit about the book because it nicely coincides with the topic tonight. Dirty politics, how attack politics is poisoning New Zealand's political environment. So that's the book that's just come out, and I think we'll be talking about it quite a bit over the next few days and weeks before Election Day. Okay, so if I can work this machine. Okay, so really the question I'm looking at tonight over the next 40, 50, whatever minutes is the question of whether politics is getting dirtier and whether this election campaign we're currently in is the most aggressive one in living memory. So the talk I'm giving, I guess isn't the most well-crafted one ever. It's not one I've given before. It's a paper that I've been slowly working over the last few years on the issue of scandals and corruption and some of the more aggressive parts of politics. And so the paper's really only half finished, hence my lecture might seem a bit half finished tonight as well. So it's a work in progress, but hopefully you're getting something fresh tonight at least. And when Rodney asked me to talk, I'd just written a column for the New Zealand Herald Online asking whether this election was going to descend into the nastiest, most scandal-mongering election campaign ever. And so when he asked me to do a talk, I thought, oh well, that's a topic I'm really interested in, so I'll try and come up with some things to talk about this. And it's because I do have an interest in issues of corruption in particular. I'm a board member for Transparency International New Zealand, so that's where I'm doing some research on corruption. And it's good to see some other people from Transparency International here tonight. But of course I follow election campaigns quite closely. That's part of my job, that's part of what I do. So I have been noticing that there's been increasing scandals in politics over the last, well, 2 decades really in New Zealand politics, but particularly even more so over recent years. And it is culminating this year in a particularly aggressive, negative campaign. So that's what I thought I'd try and unpack some of those issues and evaluate what it's all about. I chose a deliberately provocative title, throwing in those words, sex, corruption and lies, because I know everyone's interested in them. I'm interested in them, you're interested in them, and that's why you're here tonight. And it's kind of supposed to epitomise really this idea that we are actually interested in wrongdoing, we're interested in allegations and things about, yeah, sex. So, you know, it is sensationalist or to some extent, yeah, provocative. So like I said, it's actually been a wave of increasing scandals and controversies that we've been experiencing about personalities, about personal behaviour over the last 20 years, but it's been an international wave as well. We're not the only country that's experiencing an outbreak and explosion of scandals. So you can take that as a given already, that what we're experiencing in New Zealand has parallels everywhere. But there's a few other aspects that I want to talk about over the next 40 minutes or so, and explaining how the scandalisation of politics is increasing for a few other reasons as well as just contagion from what's happening globally. It's also the fact that we now we no longer have just two parties. We have a multi-party system. Ever since the late 80s, we started having new parties coming onto the scene. That's been a breakup of the monopoly, which has had an effect on the dynamic of campaigning. The shift to proportional representation, again, brought in that, kind of solidified the multi-party system and has had a big impact on what politicians talk about. More centrally, I think, is some ideological convergence. The fact that parties are shifting more towards the middle of the political spectrum. They're focusing less on policy than ever before. That's what I'm going to talk about as well, and how that's fed into scandal politics. Of course, there's been changes in the media, the whole tenor of how media have their relationships with politicians. It's a more adversarial relationship. And yeah, globally, there's been some changes, which I'll come back to. But I guess my main argument is this point here, and that is that allegations about corruption or scandals in general have become a political weapon for politicians. Politicians electioneer, they campaign on finding wrongdoing on their opponents in a way that they never used to. And then towards the end, I just want to talk about, is scandal politics a good thing or a bad thing? I think there's arguments both ways. We can't say that this is all bad or it's all good. We need to evaluate different scandals. Okay, so I guess this cartoon, I'm going to try and be quite visual tonight. I don't want to bore you with too much monologue. This cartoon is really expressing that main point that I was just talking about. This is from 2008. It's Pete Hodgson, who was the Labour Party campaign manager, and he's managed to find some dirt on his opposition. And to me, that conveys a lot about politics in the last few decades. And it's not to be mean to Pete Hodgson or the Labour Party. What I'm really trying to express tonight is that all politicians, all political parties are focused on the scandals and focused on finding wrongdoing by their opponents. And it's about the digging for dirt. It's about trying to find out the discrepancies between what their opponents say and what they do. So what is scandal? In some ways it's a difficult term to define, and so I just wanted to say something about what scandal isn't, because sometimes it's equated with corruption, and I am talking about corruption tonight, but that's just one form of scandal. And of course you can have corruption without it becoming a scandal as well, if it's not detected. And scandal definitely doesn't equal controversy. It sometimes does. I mean, I guess most scandals are controversial, but just because there's a major public dispute about something doesn't mean it's a scandal. In particular, if there's major policy fights going on in politics, that might have a lot of tension, it might have a lot of hostility and polarisation, but it doesn't mean it's a scandal. So even something like the current debate over foreign land sales, someone might say it's scandalous, but it doesn't really fit the definition of a scandal. It's more about a policy dispute. Also, I want to draw attention over the next few minutes, I guess, to the fact that there's some other changes in the way that politics operates that kind of goes along with this growth of scandal. And again, that's coming back to what Nicky Hager is talking about in his book, and that's the aggression and perhaps underhand tactics that are being used in election campaigns. And it's the focus on the gaffes, trying to highlight where people make mistakes. It's the dirty tactics, it's the negative advertising, slurs and character assassination, but not necessarily scandal. Scandal, in my view, is something whereby there's a transgression of the morals of the public. So it doesn't mean that a law's been broken, but it means that the public in some way has significant revulsion or feels that the morality has been transgressed by a politician. So sex, I'm not going to talk too much about sex, even though I've put it in the title, because I think in New Zealand politics it hasn't been a big part of our scandals, and traditionally New Zealanders don't take a huge interest in the personal lives of politicians. So if anything, we see a lot of sexual impropriety or potentially scandalous parts of the lives of politicians that goes unreported and is often quite unknown by the public. And so here's just a list of those first three things of where there have been quite well known, at least amongst the sort of political class or the Wellington Beltway, of politicians in what could have been sex scandals, but they don't get widely distributed, unlike, say, it would have happened in some other countries like the US, perhaps, or lots of other countries. So Muldoon was, well known for his affairs and his heavy drinking. It was never reported about in the media. Longy, of course, had a long-running affair with his speechwriter Margaret Pope. The press gallery at Parliament knew about that, but there was a feeling that that was a private matter, even though she was in a position of power. It still didn't come out until Longy's wife, Naomi, actually brought it out herself. And more recently, you've had lots of allegations about Don Brash's alleged affair with Diane Foreman from the Business Roundtable back in, the mid-2000s. Again, never really reported about by the media, even though there are lots of taunts about it in Parliament and lots of gossip about it. We'll come back to why perhaps the media haven't focused too much on that. But there have been some areas that the media have exploited sexual issues. One of the obvious ones is truth. Less restrained than some of the other mainstream media. The Truth newspaper exposed Marilyn Waring as being a lesbian back in 1975 when she was in Parliament. Of course, it didn't ruin her career anyway, and she stayed in politics until 1984. I guess a much more nasty episode in New Zealand political history was the outing of Colin Moyle by the Prime Minister in the early 1980s. And the Prime Minister and the House raised the fact that the police had investigated him for homosexual activity, which of course was illegal at the time. So that did become reported. More recently, you've had Graham Capel, this guy in the caricature there, who was the leader of a Christian party, the Christian Heritage Party, for about 14 years, and a campaigner on moral issues when he was eventually convicted and imprisoned for sexual offences on children. That was widely reported, and his party had to essentially disband. Richard Worth, back in 2009, got into some trouble and some sexual-related activity. John Key essentially made him resign from Parliament, resign as a minister, then resign from Parliament. And then more recently, we've had the Darren Hughes affair. Again, we never really got to the bottom of all of that, but it was certainly sufficient controversy that he again resigned from Parliament. And then more recently, the Len Brown affair, exposed initially by bloggers. Again, coming back to what this book's about. So there have been some sex scandals, but generally, as I said, there's a culture in New Zealand traditionally of fair play, where the media, voters, parliamentarians, parties feel that what goes on in politicians' private lives should stay there, and unless it's impacting on their political job, unless there's some sort of degree of hypocrisy involved, that it's not for debate. And that's been quite a convention, especially amongst Labour and National politicians for many decades, that you don't bring family members or family life into the debates in Parliament, you don't campaign on anything that the opposition do in their private life. And of course, I think there's a cultural aspect to this as well, in the sense that I think New Zealanders are just a bit less prurient about issues of sex and politics, and less interested in general, I believe, than perhaps in other cultures. What's been more important when it comes to sex scandals is how the issue has been politically managed. And that's where there's been more scope for politicians to campaign. So, for example, on the Richard Worth issue or the Darren Hughes, it became more public when there was seen to be something lacking in the way that the leaders of those parties had dealt with the issue. So in the case of Darren Hughes, Phil Goff had known about the criminal investigation by the police for many weeks and supposedly hadn't done anything about it. That was then what was criticised by his opponents. And so, as so often in scandals, it's not the original transgression, but the way that's been managed that the politicians get in trouble for. As we'll talk about a bit later, there's been escalations. So even though I'd say that sex scandals haven't been a big part of politics, they are starting to become more so. We are getting the private lives being debated a bit more in the political sphere. And as I'll come back to, in 2005, you started to see a real increase in that when Don Brash was the leader of the opposition and Helen Clark the Prime Minister. And you had a lot of rumour, innuendo about the Prime Minister and her husband, and also about the leader of the opposition. And there were a lot of taunts that started to be thrown around in Parliament amongst MPs, and it got to one stage where basically Labour and National came together and said, we've got to cool down on this because we're all going to lose. And so, as was reported at the time by TVNZ, MPs across the political spectrum are calling on each other to pull back from the brink of what's been seen as the descent into the kind of tabloid exposure of politicians' personal lives seen in Britain and the United States. So that's a bit of a theme that we'll come back to, that politicians themselves don't necessarily want scandal to be out there in the public. And often they will collude and try to call in the attack dogs and stop scandal politics exploding. But I want to really draw attention, I guess, to that electoral gain is a very powerful motivator for politicians, and so they can't entirely restrain themselves from highlighting wrongdoing by their opponents. And here's just one example of Phil Goff during that Richard Worth scandal. He made a lot of ground about that. And here's one cynical view from Tom Scott, saying that yes, he's being statesperson, or being like a statesperson in the top half, but perhaps if we really knew what was going on, we could see that his motives were less sincere. Again, around that time, I just said, of Don Brash being leader, lots of people, as portrayed here, calling out from the sewer, trying to tarnish the leader of the opposition's reputation. Moving on to what I think is the main part of scandal in New Zealand, which is around political finance. It's around the misuse of resources and, political corruption. Of course, even more so than scandal, I think political corruption is quite a hard phenomenon to actually define, because it means different things for different people. It means different things in different societies and different countries, and it's socially constructed. By that I mean that there's no real, you can't define it by law, I don't think. It's really just what someone thinks it is. So it's what people in this room thinks is corruption. I don't think there's any better definition than that, really. And I know that's not totally satisfactory, but here's a few other ways of trying to pin down what it means. So it's about contravening the laws. So breaking laws can be a part of political corruption, especially those that are pertaining to politicians. It's about the acceptance of money, so bribes, etc., by politicians or bribes from politicians, and spending money on activities, vote buying, etc., that aren't acceptable to, again, the law or to people's morality. And it's the use of state resources. I think this is a really important one, this last one, and it's one that relates a lot more to New Zealand than most countries. Okay, we'll come back to that. In New Zealand, we're seen as being fairly corruption-free. People laugh. And yeah, I think there's good reasons why you might laugh. Transparency International is the major NGO that is combating corruption around the world. And they try to measure it and get some sense of the relativities of it and how it varies over different countries. And so this map here is your sort of usual traffic lights map, whereby the red countries, or the darker red countries, are the ones that are seen to have the highest perceptions of corruption. And again, yeah, just to draw attention to that, it's the CPI, which is Corruption Perception Index. So this is an exercise that Transparency carries out globally every year, and they go around to each country and they talk to some experts, some NGOs that have expertise, I guess, in this area, and try to find out how they rate the levels of corruption in that country. And as you can see, certain parts of the world, Australasia, some parts of North America and Northern Europe tend to do very well on this map. And you can see here on this table, whoops, I've missed out last year's one, but you can see New Zealand is always at the top of the table. We're always within the top 4 since this exercise has been done back in the 1990s. So right now we're ranked first equal with Denmark as being the least corrupt countries on earth. I think there's always some disbelief, as we just experienced there, with some people laughing at the fact that there's no corruption in New Zealand. And I think that's an important debate to have. You have to realise, of course, that not only are these measures about perception of these experts, it's also, I haven't got the scores here, but I think it doesn't say we're entirely free of corruption. We're just less corrupt than some of the other countries. So I think at the moment New Zealand has a score of something like 9.1 out of 10. So, it's not saying we're perfect. There's other ways of measuring corruption, and Transparency also has this global corruption barometer where instead of asking the experts, they ask the public. They do surveys. They use professional polling businesses to ask people. So this is the results of last year's corruption barometer, and it shows to what extent various institutions in society are affected by corruption. And I don't know if you can read that very well there, but you'll see that at the top, political parties are the institution that are seen as being most affected by corruption in New Zealand. So on a scale of 1 to 5, political parties are 3.3. The media also seen as affected by corruption, the private sector, Parliament, but at the other end of the spectrum, the armed forces, hospitals, education system, judiciary, seen as being much less affected. So that at least gives us a bit of a counter to this idea that we don't have any corruption. People do think there is some corruption in New Zealand. Now, this chart here is possibly the most important one of this talk, because I do share some of this disbelief that New Zealand is corruption-free, based on my observations of politics and based on the fact that I'm seeing all these scandals going on. And following politics over the last 20 years, I can see how much the word corruption or corrupt is bandied around, which doesn't mean that there is corruption, but the allegations have grown. And so this chart here is an experiment I've tried to do whereby I've used a media database doing searches for the word corrupt and corruption as a proportion of all the articles published in New Zealand in a single year. So you can see here, if I can use my pointer, you can see here this is in the 1990s the proportion of articles published in the New Zealand media about corruption was incredibly low, virtually non-existent. Moving right to the end here of 2013, we have a huge amount of articles as a proportion. So these aren't raw numbers, this is a proportion of the publishings of the media that mention the word corrupt or corruption. Of course, the methodology is not fail-safe. There are some problems with it. For example, it could relate to what's in the Dominion Post talking about corruption in Italy or Australia, etc. So it's not necessarily all about domestic allegations of corruption. It could involve corruption in sport, in cricket, for example. So it's a slightly blunt mechanism. So it's not necessarily all about parliamentary politics by any means, but it does at least give you an idea of the increasing salience or the increasing usage of those words corrupt and corruption. And you can see that it goes up and down a bit, but the trend is definitely on the way up. And I haven't done it for this year because we haven't finished 2014, but I expect that we're going to see it rocketing even much higher due to some of the scandals that have happened this year. Okay, so on the next slide, which maybe is the most important one, which I'm sorry again, it's the wording's very small, but again, I've tried to use the same information but correlate some of the major scandals that we've had in New Zealand politics since 1990. So at the start here, this is when we had new political parties coming into the political system. So in 1989, you had the New Labour Party, which then became the Alliance. About 91, you had New Zealand First setting up, ACT setting up a wee bit later, and my argument is that that broke down essentially the cartel in the party system. You had a lot of collusion between National and Labour, an unspoken agreement where you wouldn't use that weapon against each other. You wouldn't call each other corrupt. You wouldn't investigate each other's private lives, their fundraising by the other party, the way they spend their money. Political finance was off limits essentially, but not for those new parties. And the Alliance, New Zealand First, ACT made a big deal of trying to expose some of the things that were going wrong in politics. And so the very first MMP election, you had two new scandals that we hadn't really seen a lot of in New Zealand politics. In fact, before that, whoops, gee, I'm not very good at this. You had the wine box around this time. Winston Peters really going hard on allegations of corruption and tax evasion and tax avoidance. Then after the 1996 election, Rodney Hyde was a new MP for the ACT Party, and you might remember he took on the name of the Perk Buster, and he was exposing the misuse of resources in Parliament by his fellow parliamentarians, which didn't make him very popular. Tuku Morgan, even earlier than that, straight after the election, got into some trouble over the revelation that he had spent nearly $100 of taxpayers' money on some underpants and various other clothes. And that was when he was a broadcaster for a state-owned company. So I'm not sure you could call it corruption, but lots of other parliamentarians did, and they started using those terms. 1999, which we'll come back to soon, was when the word sleaze started to be introduced to political debate. Donna Awatiri was jailed for fraud around this time, and things hit a real peak after 2005. This was the time, as we'll come back to soon, that we had a big debate over political finance with the involvement of the Exclusive Brethren in the 2005 campaign and Helen Clark and the Labour Party's use of the pledge card. You had the Electoral Finance Act come in 2008. Owen Glenn donating money to both Labour and New Zealand First. And various other scandals, as you can see, involving allegations of corruption around Sky City, around Pansy Wong, and even David Shearer just towards the end there. Okay, so we're going to go through some of those. I'm not going to talk through all of these, but it's to give you a sort of list of some of the scandals that I'm looking at in this paper that I'm writing. And so those are some of those things that are correlated on that table. Again, to emphasise that just because something is a scandal doesn't mean that it's corruption. It doesn't mean that it's proven, but it certainly was a controversy at the time when, certain things have happened. And of course they range from what might be seen as completely trivial, such as when Helen Clark signed a painting that someone else had someone else had painted, and it was investigated by the police, who found that there was a prima facie case of fraud, because the painting wasn't by Helen Clark, but she'd signed it for a charity auction, and they didn't go any further, but they did agree that on the face of it there was fraud. There's been, in other areas outside of the parliamentary arena, there's been an increase in alleged corruption. So the peak of this, and the quite ironic one, was when the auditor was jailed for fraud. This is the person in the public sector that's supposed to prevent and be the watchdog for fraud happening in the public sector. He himself was jailed for a couple of years for fraud. At this time we had increasing scandals about the misuse of taxpayers' money and perks in the public sector, about inflated salaries, etc. And so Greg Newbold, the criminal sociologist, said at this time, "The squandering of millions of dollars by politicians and public servants through expensive trips abroad, golden handshakes and opulent conferences is now well known." And so the politicians picked up on this and started campaigning on it. So we got to the point that the 1999 general election, Labour campaigned very strongly on things not being right in the public sector, things not being right in the Shipley government of the time. And there were some scandals involving the Tourism Board, etc. And they campaigned to get rid of this. Now I'm just going to go to a few case examples of what I think have been landmark scandals. So of course the 2005 Exclusive Brethren participation in politics, when members of that church group, wealthy individuals, got together and put out some election advertisements, mostly pamphlets that they put in houses throughout the country. There's not much certainty on how much they spent. It was probably about $500,000, some say $1 million. These were election advertisements trying to convince people not to vote for Labour or vote for the Greens, and in subtle ways trying to convince voters to give their party vote to the National Party. Of course, the National Party denied any involvement, and strictly speaking, there was nothing to tie the two groups together. Of course, that was until Nicky Hagar's Hollow Men came out, and he had much stronger evidence to show that there had been some collusion involved between National and that church group. It's still not clear that there was any illegality involved, and in fact I think there's a very strong argument that it actually did a lot of harm for National, that National potentially lost the election because of that scandal. And you also have to remember that it wasn't entirely unique. There'd been lots of other NGOs, trade unions, interest groups that had also in the past campaigned for or against political parties. But nonetheless, this was quite a big one. This was much more money than had been used in the past, and it was much more aggressive and much more secretive. Therefore, it created a lot more heat and a lot more resentment from the governing Labour Party. But also at that election, you had the pledge card scandal. So this piece of election advertising was put out by the Labour Party at a few elections, 3 in a row actually, 1999, 2002, 2005, and they'd used their parliamentary budgets to pay for that, and they regarded it as part of their communications with their constituency and didn't regard it as electioneering because it didn't say vote Labour. But it did, on the back of it, give all these essentially policy lists of what that party would do if they got back into power. The Auditor General, during the 2005 election, it's quite a long, complex story, but the Auditor General eventually got wind of this and thought, well, this actually looks like election advertising, and he investigated after the election and found that, Labour had spent nearly $500,000 on this, but that they weren't the only party. That just about every party in Parliament had been using their parliamentary budgets for all sorts of advertising, for leaflets, for everything they did during the campaign, just about. And so, looking at those last few weeks of the campaign, he found that there had been $1.5 million by all the parties spent on electioneering out of the public purse. So his report was quite a landmark event for political finance. The government responded, or Parliament responded, by taking quite extreme step of making it legal what had been, making legal what had been illegal. They retrospectively said that illegal spending was now okay, and most of the parties also paid it back as a gesture of goodwill, I guess, apart from New Zealand First. And at the time, there was quite a lot of unhappiness from the public about this money being spent, which we'll come back to. Soon after this, it became apparent that Owen Glenn, one of New Zealand's wealthiest individuals, had also given a lot of money to Labour. At that stage, it was the biggest known donation we've had in political history, $500,000. That's been overshadowed in recent time by donations from Kim.com to the Internet Party and donations from people like Colin Craig to his own Conservative Party, but at the time it was the biggest known donation in history. He had also loaned money to the Labour Party, which was rather secretive. And there were rumours that he had given money to Winston Peters. And Winston Peters very strongly denied that he'd taken money from Owen Glenn, even having this press conference where he said, "I can't make this clearer," and he held up a sign saying, "No, I haven't received money." Of course, it then became apparent that he had received the money later when there was an investigation into it. And the only uncertain thing was about whether Peters had known about the money. He claimed, yes, we had received it, but I didn't know about it. And there was disputes about that. Owen Glenn saying that that Peters did know about it. What was controversial was that at the time, Peters was also the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and Owen Glenn had been campaigning with Peters to get an honorary consul position in Monaco, which he never got in the end, but Peters did promise it to him. So again, there were a lot of questions about the relationship between money and politics. And I can see the time is moving on quite fast, so I will try and speed up. But another really important one, I think, from 2008 was the so-called H-fee scandal. It wasn't really a total scandal because it never actually worked out, and I'll just go over it very quickly. Labour had been promising that they were going to drop a bomb during the election campaign. We seem to hear that a lot these days. .com's promising one now. I think Nikki Hager has dropped one with this book, which we'll talk about soon. And it involved a lot of dirt digging on John Key's past background, and Labour put a lot of resources into going back over financial deals that he'd done when he was a money trader. In the end, Labour had nothing, and it really backfired, I think. No incriminating evidence was really found, but Labour put a lot of effort into trying to show that you couldn't trust John Key, and it was supposed to tie in with their main campaign slogan, which was about trust, that you could trust the government, you couldn't trust John Key. And these are some related cartoons, but I don't think we've got time to read them, but again, just relating to the fact that there was dirt digging going on, that the only way the government felt that they could stay in power was to tarnish the reputation of their opponents. And again, this is just one example, and as we'll come back to, I feel the same thing happens now with the current government. And of course, there's been ongoing controversies about the use of MP perks and resources, starting, of course, with the UK MP expenses, which was a huge scandal over there. It had a contagion factor. It was like an earthquake that the ripples eventually got to New Zealand, and people started to ask about what resources were being used and appropriate here. And lots of MPs had their downfalls because of it. And the archetypal one was Rodney Hyde, who, as I talked about earlier, had been a major perk buster, campaigning against politicians using resources inappropriately for their own personal aggrandisement. He was found to have done the same. He hadn't broken any laws, he hadn't broken any rules, he'd taken his girlfriend on a global trip as a minister, but because the hypocrisy factor was seen as so large, he was in a lot of trouble. Again, all parties have suffered some sorts of misdemeanours. Philip Field, eventually jailed for fraud and bribery. Again, with the MP expenses, Shane Jones was probably the one that we'll remember for the longest time, unfortunately. So why has this been arising? Why do we have these explosions of scandals that we didn't used to have? And this, again, is coming back to the crux of my argument, is that in the past, Labour and National quite sensibly didn't fire off the nuclear missiles at each other. They knew that it was an unwinnable war where they would all suffer. If you started making allegations about how the opponents are using taxpayer resources or how they're fundraising, they knew that the same nuclear missile was going to come straight back at them for what they're doing. And so it suited everyone to not mention these things. It was an unspoken rule. It was essentially a cartel. But of course, once the two-party system started breaking down, these other parties came in, especially with MMP. The whole collusion could no longer work. And so 1999, I think, was a turning point where Labour successfully campaigned against government sleaze and came into government themselves on that. But then at 2005, with the Exclusive Brethren and the pledge card scandals, everything broke down and people didn't hold back. So the nuclear button had been pushed, and the nuclear detente, if you like, no longer underpinned political debate and competition. And so you ended up having, advertisements like this. This was in the Wellington Airport, a national advertisement, playing on this idea that there were all these scandals like Watergate that were besieging the Prime Minister. I won't go through all this, but I'll just, again, emphasise the fact that Don Brash, just after 2005, he said this government has no legitimacy. It's the most corrupt government in New Zealand history, which is quite an extraordinary statement, and it shows the strength of feeling. And fast forward to 2014, with other scandals coming out, Labour in particular started to hit National over the head about Don Walu and his donations to National. John Key quite pointedly in Parliament said, "Be careful, Labour Party, if you really want to go down this track, there will be retaliation." And that's exactly what happened, and we saw some scandals come out that hurt Labour involving that. So is this all good for democracy, or is it bad? I don't think you can really say it's one or the other. Like I said before, all the parties use it. I don't think there's one party that's better than the other. They all want to do it, so they want to dig dirt on their opponents. And And in some ways, I think it is a good thing. It's good that the parties keep each other's democratic health in check. One of the ways that we can keep New Zealand corruption-free is by having such pressure on politicians. And if they are self-regulating by looking out for corrupt activities, misuses of resources, etc., we have more chance of knowing about it. And so in some ways, it's a good way of monitoring and suppressing corruption and untoward activity. And of course, so counterintuitively, the more allegations you have about corruption could mean the less corrupt behaviour there actually is. So the visibility of corruption isn't equating with the levels of corruption. It just might be the case that now there's more allegations and we, little corruption perhaps that exists in New Zealand we know about, whereas in the past we just didn't know about it. And it's certainly the case that some scandals strengthen democracy because we see that the culprits are publicised, they're dealt with in one way or another by public opinion or by the courts. And therefore, we can see that the system perhaps works. John Banks, leaves Parliament because of his donations to Kim.com, to John Banks, sorry. Kim.com's donations to John Banks and the way that he allegedly configured those. And of course, there's the false scandals. So sometimes there's controversies where the public actually ends up siding with the politician, with the party, and they feel that the allegations have been exaggerated, that the media or the politicians are making too much of what's happened, and that it's not a legitimate scandal. I'm going to speed through this quite quickly to say that, a big reason why I also think we're seeing more debate about corruption and personal behaviour is the fact that we have a much more centre-orientated party system than we've ever had before. So this is just one measure of where political parties sit on political spectrums, and increasingly we're seeing that they're bunching up in the middle. And in the past, I think it was much easier to tell the differences between some of the parties, especially between Labour and National. Increasingly, they are borrowing each other's policies. Increasingly, it's harder to differentiate them. And they speak less about policies than ever before. This is just some of my own research on where the parties are, which isn't in my paper, which maybe we'll skip over. So in lieu of the great big differences between left and right, the great big policy debates that we're used to in New Zealand, there's more focus by the politicians themselves, by the parties, on presidentialised campaigning, on putting the leaders and their attributes forward as reasons why you should vote for them. And so instead of trying to bring down your opponents on the basis of what they're putting forward as policies, there's a bigger inclination to try and tarnish their integrity, their competency, and politicians are therefore really vulnerable on those issues because they put forward their brand as being John Key or David Cunliffe or whoever, and that's why people vote for those parties, because they like those people or not. And trust is what we're supposed to see as one of our main ways of measuring the votability of a party. So the media itself has also changed, and there's been some significant rebalancing of the politician-media or the politician-journalist relationship, and there's no doubt at all that the media today is more interested in fights and wrongdoing and exposing what's going on below the surface. So again, that could be seen as a good thing. More than ever before, I think politics is being reported by journalists that want to speak truth to power, if you like. So whether it's Nikki Hager or anyone else, they are trying to get below what the official version of things are. On the other hand, yeah, there's a lot more focus also on gaffes, on the stumbles by politicians, by some of the more minor things that they get wrong. I might just move on a bit, but there's a lot more aggression from the media, and we're seeing this globally, and it's really started in a big way with these guys in the 1970s with Watergate, and ever since that time, journalists and the public saw investigative journalists as heroes, people that were calling power to account. And suddenly you had a much more culture of contempt in the media, where they wanted to bring down governments, bring down politicians, bring down those in authority. There's questions about whether that's gone too far, whether there's the right balance or not, and whether attack journalism has undermined democracy too much. But it's certainly not a case that I think that we can say that uncovering scandals is bad per se. Again, I might just move on to give at least you guys a chance to contribute to the discussion. There's also another option, of course, that possibly politicians are becoming more corrupt. Maybe they are more focused on getting resources either for themselves or for the parties. Maybe they are more venal than in the past. Certainly there's an argument that could be made that the type of politicians we have in 2014 are quite different in their motivations to politicians that we had many decades ago. And that's because politics is more of a career for politicians. In the past, you came into Parliament after a career as a farmer, a teacher, and doing that for many decades. And often a parliamentary term or 3 was seen as public service, as a duty. Now it's much more common for politicians to come into politics in their 20s, their 30s, after time working in that parliamentary institution, working as researchers, as spin doctors, working in student politics or other NGOs, and it's a political class. And you're there because it's your career and you want to be there for many decades. And that puts a different motivation on what you're doing in politics, and you expect to be well remunerated because you could be off doing PR or something else in the private sector. So there's some arguments around that as well. Also, the parties themselves in this heavily professionalised era need resources. They need money to be able to electioneer more than ever before, and increasingly they're actually having trouble, apart from the dot-coms and the Colin Craigs, they're having trouble getting that money in terms of donations. They certainly don't have members in the way that they used to have to fundraise and give membership subscriptions. So more than ever before, they're turning to those parliamentary resources as a lucrative way of carrying out their operations. So again, I think that's why we're having some more scandals around the misuse of resources. And I will actually just quickly jump in with the Nikki Hagar book in case you haven't already heard about it. Because it relates to this. It's the story of how the national government is using mostly bloggers and spin doctors for their electioneering. And so, I haven't read it, it's only just come out not long ago, but mostly it's about how some of the communication advisors in John Key's office play a very central role in the blogosphere, if you like, especially around websites like Whale Oil, run by Cameron Slater. And that it's these taxpayer-funded operatives that are responsible for much of the aggression in politics. And so that's why I think we're going to be talking a lot more about this sort of thing over the next few days. So, and just very briefly, in a few minutes, to talk about some of the other impacts of this explosion of scandals. And I haven't yet found reliable enough data looking at New Zealanders' trust in some of the important institutions of democracy, but certainly you can look at this one in the US, and you can see the effect of what happened in the 1960s with lots of challenges to the institutions of power, especially Watergate, and in general there's a much greater cynicism about those in authority in Western nations. Political parties, I showed you this thing before, political parties, their perceptions are very low, and there's all sorts of other evidence of this. There was a comprehensive survey done back in 2005, whoops, doing this again, which showed that 3/4 of the public had little or no confidence in political parties, and some similar results about Parliament and MPs in this slide here. Whoops. So around 2/3 of the public from that same survey had either not very much confidence or none at all in Parliament. So, and there's lots of other research that I'm trying to get into this paper that I'm writing at the moment to suggest that we're a lot more cynical about politics, and that I think it correlates again with the rise of these scandals and allegations of corruption. Likewise, in a reverse pattern, we can see voter turnout in elections going right down. So at the last election, of all eligible voters, about 68 or 69% turned out on election day to vote. Again, another indicator of the democratic deficit, which might correlate with increasing scandals. Lots of other metrics for measuring the health of democracy, political party membership. Back in the 60s, about 24% of voters belonged to a political party in New Zealand. Now it's down to about 2 or 3%. So it's gone from 1 in 4 voters to about 1 in 50. Again, another indication that we want to be less associated with politicians. Just before I finish off, I also want to talk about how, although I think it's good that we are probing what's going on below the surface and that we're calling out politicians for misuse of resources, etc., I think there's also a chance that it's having a conservatising influence on wider society. That, in particular, this fear of scandal, especially for politicians, is so great now that they are ultra cautious, and it makes their campaigning, their whole way they operate, being a bit more bland. They see themselves as targets for the opponents and are just so careful in all their policy pronouncements, all their ways of operating. They know that they are being monitored and therefore aren't inclined to say anything that might be too radical or could be interpreted badly. And so it's reinforced what I think is quite blandness in politics, and it's given a lot more power to the spin doctors who have control to make sure that the messages of the parties are not problematic. But also, I think in wider society, it's good that we have a greater awareness of corruption and conflicts of interests than ever before, but perhaps we have too much awareness of it, and we are too worried about being accused of being biased or being accused of doing things wrong. And I was just thinking about this on the way here. My wife is on a board of trustees for a primary school where one of our kids goes, and she was trying to get the board of trustees to run election debate for our local electorate in the school hall. But the Board of Trustees was totally against it, saying, oh, there could be allegations of conflicts of interests, or the questions we use might be biased because we're asking them about education. And so it was decided, no, we can't go there. Again, just another example of how we're so scared of conflicts of interests and being seen as biased that sometimes we might be inclined not to do anything at all. So some conclusions are that scandals can be illuminating, but they can have some negative impacts. We could be shifting to this sort of scandal fatigue syndrome, where we get sick of these allegations. But overall, I don't think we can say scandals are good or bad. I guess if I asked you individually about some of the scandals I've talked about, whether it's the Exclusive Brethren one or the use of pledge cards, you'll have different views on whether it was a legitimate focus for the public and the media. And we can look back at some of the scandals of this year about, say, alleged Don Walu donations to Labour, or the Orovida scandal with Judith Collins, and some people will think that those are totally inappropriate scandals, and others will think it's good that those things have been brought to the public surface. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that, and in general I think we need better quality scandals, would be one of my conclusions, and that it's good to be looking at what's going wrong with those in the elite, but we also have to be careful about whether some of these scandals might be distorting our images of democracy and reality. But overall, what we need is to, I guess, be a bit more mature in our approach to scandals. And I think this is happening. Generally, the public are getting used to scandals being around, and they're becoming a bit more critically minded in evaluating them, and not instantly just believing anything that the media says about a politician. And I think that's the best track to go down, that we have a more nuanced approach to allegations that are being thrown around. Okay, I'll leave it there, and hopefully you guys can throw in your own, is that right, Rodney? Their own point of view, or?
Yep, I've got a microphone here. Bryce, first question.
Hello. As you said that we need to have really serious scandal, but I think that even bringing like Judith Collins kind of scandal, which are not proven, or these politicians, they learn a lesson. Next time they will be thinking before those kind of things happen, although they are not proven. But it does send a signal and a message to those politicians that what public sees now in the this kind of communication age, where information is on the fingertip, and not just social media is so important and strong. So I think it does matter. The other thing is, you never talked about the Maurice Williamson's scandal in this whole thing.
Yeah.
And my question is, again, I don't know whether it's related to this one, but two international one, how the New Zealand politics or politicians are affected by Snowden, the guy, and the other one who is hiding in the embassy in Britain. Yeah, those two. So how is New Zealand politicians?
Okay, I might just get some more responses first and come back to some of those points. If there is anything else.
It's just one down.
Those are good questions.
Hi, I'm sort of doing some research along these sort of lines, so I just have a question that's sort of related to how you're going about establishing what actually is a scandal, because you said that to be a scandal, it's a transgression that offends the majority of society.
Not necessarily the majority, but yeah.
And then there's also a sort of argument that anything that establishes, sort of obtains a certain level of media attention becomes a scandal. So I'm just wondering how you reconcile the two in a sort of environment where scandals are pushed so much by the media. How do you determine if something is actually offending the majority or offending enough people to be considered a scandal?
Okay, well, I'll try and answer some of those points. Actually, I'll start with that last one first. So I think perhaps, if I'm interpreting you right, one of the main points that we have to be aware of is, does the media equal the public? Because it's quite possible that what the media is saying isn't very reflective of public opinion at all. And in fact, or if it is, it's the media driving a public opinion. So, no, I don't think there's any easy answer to that, I have to say. There are, opinion polls that I think are useful for getting a public sense of this. I certainly don't think it's a majority that you need before a scandal is a scandal. And really I don't think there's any sort of threshold that you decide. And there's, I guess, a spectrum of different scandalettes, minor scandals, major scandals, game changers in politics, etc. But I'll think about that a bit more. But I guess it does relate to the whole nebulous nature of a lot of this, that it's hard to have hard and fast categories and ways of measuring the differences. And to come back to that first one about Williamson, so Maurice Williamson resigned as minister related to his involvement with Don Walu and his advocacy on his behalf to the police. Yes, I haven't got round to adding that into the paper that I'm working on, but yes, just yet one more example of scandals exploding and having a real impact. And what I was trying to get at, though, before was that that was a really good indicator that scandal politics hurts all politicians, because, of course, then National retaliated, in my view at least, and released information to the media which was perhaps correct or incorrect, which hurt Labour about donations. And it's an ongoing saga. I don't think we've seen the end of it. I'm just trying to remember, what was your other question? Snowden, yes. I mean, it's fascinating, the Snowden situation, and again, it gives a hint of the democratisation, especially with digital technologies, of information, and the fact that great governments, very powerful governments, are still vulnerable to flaws in the system that can reveal massively embarrassing secrets. So yeah, Julian Assange as well with WikiLeaks. I mean, I personally find it quite reassuring that powerful governments still have to be kept on their toes and aren't totally formidable. But it's just the start of what's happening, and it is a bit scary about where it could go, because there's always going to be need for some secrecy. Governments do need to be able to work in private, as do the rest of citizens. So there are questions about to what extent surveillance of any of us or of governments or political actors becomes too much easily available, and there are privacy issues there.
Yes, I'm really concerned about the amount of time that scandals take up, particularly in the media. Sure, we want the concise reporting of them. I don't think that things should be, hushed up. We should know what's going on. But one has this feeling of unease that they're almost being used to cover up what else is going on. Like if you can get a scandal against the other party, something else that's happening over here can have the spotlight taken off it, and the media seems to be buying into this in the same way that magazines of all types are just centred on people and their lives, their imperfect lives, rather than anything of real substance. And this really concerns me, that there's a downgrading of the media that somehow is being exploited by all this.
I think you've put that brilliantly, absolutely. And if you look at what's in the news media over the last day or two, it's been about, in terms of politics at least, it's been about videos from the Internet Mana Party and offence about that. It's been about various claims about, I don't know, all sorts of things. Nothing actually about policy. Very little about policy debates, even though we're in the midst of an election campaign. And so I share your concern, but I might be inclined to look at it a wee bit round the other way, in that scandals are the result of the fact that there's less policy debate. And there has been some research to show that scandals tend to get more oxygen, tend to be pushed more when there's not much on the news agenda. So they come in to replace the missing news. But no, but you're still right that it would be a great democratic tragedy if we end up just discussing wrongdoings and the more trivial sides of politicians rather than discussing different ways to run the world and different alternatives and views. And that's what election campaigns should be, really, not about focus on the personalities. So I do agree with you. But I just point again, that's why I'm coming to the conclusion that we need better scandals rather than... so scandal per se isn't a good or bad thing. Some of them are illuminating and are necessary, which, I might be biased, but I think this will be a necessary one that helps us better understand power in New Zealand. But there's other ones that are sideshows that are less relevant, and my hope would be that as society, as the media, we become better at discerning the more quality and appropriate scandals. So hopefully that kind of answers your concerns.
My question's about the fact that it's more about the person and not the issue, and the ratio between the personality of the person and the profile and the issue is askew. And because really that's the most important thing. But it seems to me it's a response of our movement to presidential politics, coupled with personalities and having had two very strong leaders as prime ministers. Perhaps that if John Key were to lose, then we wouldn't have such strength and leadership, and therefore the balance might shift.
Yeah, I think you've answered it yourself. And it's the way I view it, that the politicians and parties have brought this on themselves. They are the ones that have put forward the personalities and campaigned on the basis of the attributes of their leadership, and that makes them vulnerable to their opponents, whose main methods of electioneering is to try and negate that. There's other factors as well, and it's cheap. Yep.
Your suggestion that the political parties have all moved to the centre, surely that means there's no policy to debate.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is arguable. There's some people that will quite strongly argue, that there's a huge difference between Labour and National, and that they are wanting to take society in very different directions. I just think that politics has become less about the big ideas than it used to be. So even in the sort of post-war period in New Zealand, where sometimes there weren't big differences between Labour and National, there were kind of some big anchoring ideas of capitalism and socialism, and you had, for better or worse, the Cold War going on, which kind of anchored the debate a bit more. And that played a really important part, I think, in keeping the parties a bit further apart. And we talked about some bigger issues about creating the good society than we do now. Now it tends to be more managerial, I believe.
I've got a question about investigative journalism, and you highlighted the fact that this was, Watergate and some of those juicy events. And I guess I see investigative journalism as trying to find a variety of views and challenging people's views. How do you rate the journalists in New Zealand today and your desire for more mature scandals?
Well, again, I guess I've already shown my biases by saying that, I think Nikki Hager is the preeminent investigative journalist. I think this will be in the newspapers and TV over the next few days, if not weeks. But in terms of those people employed by the mainstream media, no. There's not much going on. The Dominion Post has Phil Kitchen, who I think is a very good investigative journalist here, and there's some other ones, people like David Fisher with the Herald, and Andrew Vance has done some good work within the Parliamentary Gallery. So there are some really good journalists, I think, working in New Zealand that do, and the media, in some areas do quite well, but they don't have much resources. and the media is fighting this battle where their business model is falling apart. You know, newspapers aren't making money, most media isn't making money, so they do have problems being able to put the resources into someone to be able to spend 6 months or a year, like they used to, on a story. So there are problems. So my feeling is that the media can sometimes do short-term investigations quite well, but they don't have the long-term, in-depth stuff, and that democracy is poorer because of that. And I think it becomes important for other people to rise up and play a part in that debate, because I don't think journalists can. So yeah, people like Nikki Hagar or academics or people in the community, bloggers, because I'm kind of pessimistic about the way the media is going, but I also think that changes in new technology do make it possible that, you know, it's a bit of a cliche, but we can all be part of the media. We can all publish our research and ideas online, and it's a very democratic potential, I think. But I'm not sure that really will make you feel much better.
One of the areas I'd be interested in your comment on is the difference between mistakes and corruption or scandals, and the impact that has on the risk averseness and they're unwilling to take risks and be exciting and innovative in our policies.
I guess, once again, I think you've answered it already in what you're saying by indicating that the more trivial and non-policy related mistakes that politicians make are too focused on, and yes, they do make them too risk adverse. And so that's my hope, that we become less focused on that and less focused on the gaffes. I think we all do get drawn into them nonetheless, and it's maybe human nature to respond to the sensationalism of some of those things that happen in politics. So I don't think any of us, or I'm certainly not immune from it, but as we mature, I hope that we become better able to discern the more important scandals than the unimportant. Does that at all?
I wonder if you're underplaying the point about the business structure of the media in the change over the past 30, 40 years. So think about the massively exciting media environment of Dunedin 30 years ago when I was growing up there. And it was kind of one newspaper and one television channel which didn't have to advertise and it was owned by the state, and and a couple of radio stations, but pretty much very, very low numbers. Not many of them had to advertise, much more state ownership, very little competition. I've now got 12 different media apps on this phone, and they're all competing, and they have to compete. And what gets attention is puerile stories. So I wonder if actually when we're looking for who cast the original stone here, was it the politicians getting more puerile, or was it actually a dramatic change in the structure of the media?
Okay, there's quite a lot there, and certainly on that last point, of course, it's one of those situations where things have happened in tandem and they've been self-reinforcing. So I'm not inclined to entirely blame the politicians or entirely blame the media, and certainly not any specific journalists. But there has been a tabloidisation and sensationalism that's been brought into the media, where they're so much more competitive. And they know that their jobs depend on getting readership and audience, and to do that you need the shock, you need the horror. If it bleeds, it leads, is the cliche for the front page on what we'll actually get there. But I think most people are more inclined to blame the media, and I'm a bit more inclined to blame politics in the way that the politicians have dumbed down their messages and have gone for the more opportunistic ways of fighting against each other.
I've just got perhaps one final question, Bryce. Last week, Colin Campbell-Hunt spoke about the economics around climate change and things, and I think one of the points that was made there was increasingly perhaps how the world is looking at New Zealand to lead the way in, you know, some of the issues confronting the world at this stage. So is there a danger that we actually take our eyes off the ball in the big picture of what New Zealand can contribute to society overall?
Well, I think, yeah, with scandals and the focus on wrongdoing, inevitably we're going to be less focused on the important things. Absolutely, that's a real danger, and you know, there's all sorts of democratic deficits that will flow through, and arguably make the government make politics work less well, which will produce the economy working less well. I don't know, that's a big question. I'm still really reflecting on it.
I don't expect.
I'll reflect on it.
Reflect on it.
Over a beer.
Yeah, no, that's good. Bryce, look, on behalf of us all, thank you very much. I think, just from a personal point of view, I think looking at some of your slides and putting into context some of the things that we've all been through over the last, 20 plus years, it has been good. And so we thank you for making the time out of your very, very busy schedule to come and speak here. And so just like to thank you in the usual way.
Okay, thanks.
Just from my perspective, I could just thank everybody for coming along, and for those people who have supported the Winter Lecture Series this year. I think we've had 6 very, very enlightening lectures in the context of you and your world. So we're definitely continuing the series again next year, and we'll come up with some more really good speakers that promote the research that's being carried out at the University of Otago, which in many cases is world leading. So thank you very much. You're very welcome to join us now and join Bryce and continue the discussion. Thank you.
Oh, great.